submission, how does that? Well, it's going to come out in having this ultimate taslim, this ultimate peace with God in such a way that you're in the world but not of it. Or as someone said, you might have the world in your hand but it's not in your heart. These kinds of things. So you're living basically, you are living in the way that you are meant to live because you yourself are from two different worlds. So your soul is not from here. Right? Where does that come from? The soul is not from here, but your body is here. And speaking in dualist terms, being I guess sort of Platonic about it, you are a combination of body and soul. And the combination of body and soul, you are by that fact, if you accept that, you are actually a combination between the material and the immaterial. You're kind of a paradox. And so is this. And when those two things are in submission, in other words, they are compliant with the conditions of the transaction, the person is excellent at that time. Okay, so over a period of time, if that's clear, anyone have any questions about that part? Because that's kind of a review. You already explained that pretty well. Or very well, yeah.
Is the idea of the transaction similar to the idea of being redeemed in Christianity?
How so?
Well, so there's a lot of language about, one of the things I was noticing when we were reading the textbook was there was this discussion early on of, who was it? It was not Abd Allah. One of the sons of the prophet's ancestors had been, his father had promised that he would give him to God and would sacrifice him. And God, in the text, seemed to have redeemed him, there was some kind of exchange in which there were camels that were given.
I see. Yeah, that's Abdul Latif. So basically what it is that, from what I know, is that it is in a sense, because you're entering into a contract. The redemption is the idea that as long as you hold up your part, then as long as you hold up your end of the deal. In other words, the idea is this, that God has a right. God has a right. What is this? Why does he have a right? He has a right, since he brought everything into existence, he has a right over it. And that right over existence is that he not be associated with. Meaning, kind of like, okay, if I give you, this is very, I'm kind of personifying things quite a bit, but just as a way to, analogously. If I give someone a gift, for example, and then they praise the gift, and then they love the gift so much that they forget about the one who gave the gift, that would cause me to have some dismay about this person because they completely not acknowledge my existence. That is a pretty far analogy to the relationship that is expected from the Muslim towards God, because God doesn't need anything. But he does have his station, you can say. His station does have a right over people. And so in other words, the fabric of reality, according to the Muslim tradition, Islamic tradition, is that God has a right. And if you do not give him his right, you're going against the fabric of reality. And as a result, you're putting yourself outside the scope of God's mercy. But you're doing it yourself. You're asking for it, in that sense. Because God has a right. The redemption would be, and we're kind of prone to do that because we just have our ideas. We're kind of prone. So the redemption would be if you say, I bear witness that there's no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of peace upon him. Then you've entered back into, granted it's a very mighty claim, back into the fabric of reality. And by doing so, it's like the flood of Noah, basically. Those people who ran to the mountain, they ran to something else besides God. They were taken by the flood. Whereas those who went to God, they went into the ark. So the transaction is kind of like the ark of Noah, you can say. If that makes any kind of sense. I don't really want to personify God like that, but I'm just trying to find ways to
In Protestant Christianity, one of the principles of theology is sola fide, or faith alone, in contradistinction to more in the Catholic tradition, where works kind of contribute to one's being justified before God. So can you elaborate on what is the purpose of good works in the Islamic tradition? how was one justified? How was one seen as saved in that tradition?
From what I know, there's differences in that. The reason why you act is because God commanded you to. And it's the right of God to command his property to do as he likes to do with it. And so God commands the creation to act. He decides, and this is a very specific answer because it's based in Sunni Islam, based upon Ash'ari creed and so forth. But the response that I would give would be that God creates the human being and then commands the human being to do his bidding because it's his property and that's the nature of that relationship. And we're commanded to do what he considers to be good, not what we ourselves are considered to be good. And that is why we have law. And we're commanded to respond to each situation appropriately based upon the law itself. And in terms of reward and punishment, the reward and punishment, according to the Ash'aris, that creedal system that we explained, a person can do all the right things and have all the T's crossed and all the I's dotted. And if God wants to, he can put them in the deepest, lowest parts of hell if he wants to. Or a person who appears to be, I think the word is calcitrant, a person who is just a wrongdoer in every step of the way, it is quite possible for God to put that person into heaven. And the reason being is because God is not bound by anything. God's not bound by some kind of morality that we would impose upon him, but he can do as he likes to do. He will do what he wants to do. The Quran says, you will be asked about what you do, and he himself will not be asked. So that means the only way that a person can really get into paradise is through God's grace, which is, I think that's kind of closer to some of the Christian themes I've heard. But the way you get into paradise is through God's grace. So the Prophet said that none of us will enter paradise by virtue of our deeds. And they were like, wait, what do you mean? Not even you? He said, not even me. Unless God would envelop me with his mercy. So this idea of grace is central to the Muslim ethos, except for, and it's demanding because you know at the end of the day that if I do all this work, well, the question is then why are you doing the work in the first place?
So I was going to ask.
Yeah, like why do all the work then? Right, it's a good question. Like why do all the work? I mean, at the end of the day, he decides what's what, but it's because it's God's right. You do it because he owns you, it's his right. And that calls for this thing called taqwa. Taqwa, which is an Arabic term meaning God consciousness, is that you worship God in a way that makes him happy, not in a way that makes you happy. And that's, again, happiness is funny for God, but you worship God in a way that pleases him, that doesn't earn his anger, not in a way that just makes you satisfied. So how will I be able to do that? Well, here's the steps that you need to do. And the sign of someone having success in their endeavor is that whatever it is that God does with them, they find happiness with it, they're pleased with him. So it's a very, very kind of demanding relationship. If a person has any other object but God in mind, very demanding. If it's not demanding, if it's not demanding on that person, then they find wisdom in everything. They find wisdom because one of the traditions says, "I am to my slave as he thinks of me." I'm to my slave as he or she thinks of me. Meaning that you and I could be enduring the same situation, but God shows you something in that situation that is the light of lights. Whereas I'm sitting with you and we're both in prison and I'm looking at you like you've lost your mind. Like Joseph, I don't know in the biblical tradition if it's narrated like this, but Joseph was in the prison. Or Abraham was in the fire. Abraham's in the fire, and in Muslim tradition, Islamic tradition, he was there for 40 days. And that fire was the best, it was like Club Med for him. Because he told the fire to become cold, which has a lot of interesting causal questions. But and at the same time, in our tradition, it's narrated that the fire burnt off the ropes on his arms, because he was bound. It burnt the ropes off, but didn't burn his skin. So anyway, Abraham was just kind of, to use the common vernacular, chilling in Club Fire for 40 days, and it was the best time of his life. And that has to do with the relationship that God has with the slave and the benefit. I am to my slave as a king to thee. And this is kind of explains some of the ideas about miracles and things like that I think occur across the board in each tradition, that each Abrahamic tradition, that a person has such certainty in God that God begins to bend things for them, which has a lot to do with this very personal relationship that we have. He sees you wherever you are. And he can make it easy and make it difficult for you however he likes, so forth and so on. So not to go into a tangent, but why is it then that why does the Muslim act at all? Because God says so. You move because he said so. You stop because he said so. End of story. So again, that's why I said the whole thing is about submission. It's about submission. And it's submission on the nature of submission is that you submit to someone else's terms, which is what transaction means. So, okay. Now what I wanted to kind of, because this is more of a review. Islam is about the limbs, and what example do we have to be able to know how this is going to work? This is why prophecy is so important. Because at the end of the day, the human is the Muslim, the human is the mu'min, and the human is the muhsin. So okay, I need an example. Like, show me how I'm supposed to do this. And so this is what we have in the Prophet Muhammad. We have this example that is going to show the one who follows his way how to interact with God on a daily basis. It's not just him, also with his companions as well. So the companions, in other words, you have 23 years. That's how long he lives on the earth after the prophetic dispensation. You got 23 years to cover the rest of time. So you have his example, and you have those examples of people that were around him, who believed in him and died on faith. All of those outward activities are sort of codified in this thing called fiqh. Which means, it actually means, its linguistic meaning is understanding. But it becomes later to mean the technical term, which is truth. It coincides, or it has an equivalent in the term jurisprudence.